But anyway, let us continue with Chapter 7, the Chateau d'If. Crossing the antechamber, the Commissioner of Police gestured to 2 gendarmes who took up their positions on either side of Dantès. A door leading from the chambers of the Crown Prosecutor to the law courts was opened, and they went along one of those long, dark corridors that inspire a shudder in all who enter them, even when they have no cause to fear. Just as Villefort's chambers gave access to the Palais de Justice, so the Palais de Justice gave access to the prison, a sombre pile overlooked by the bell tower of Les Écules, which rises opposite and examines it with curiosity from every gaping aperture. After several twists and turns in the corridor down which they went, Dantès saw a door with an iron wicket open before him. The police commissioner knocked on it with a little hammer, and the 3 blows sounded to Dantès as though they had been struck against his heart. The door opened, and the 2 gendarmes gently pushed their prisoner forward, for he still hung back. Dantès crossed the awful threshold, and the door closed noisily behind him. He now breathed a different atmosphere, where the air was heavy and sulphurous. He was in prison. He was taken to a cell that was quite clean, despite the bars and locks. The appearance of his surroundings consequently did not arouse too much fear in him. In any case, the deputy prosecutor's words, spoken in tones that seemed to Dantès to express such concern, still echoed in his ears like a sweet promise of hope. It was already 4 o'clock when Dantès was led into his cell. As we have already mentioned, it was March the 1st, so the prisoner would soon be in darkness. His hearing became more acute as his sight dimmed, and at the slightest sound which reached him, convinced that they were coming to set him free, he leapt up and took a step towards the door, but the noise soon faded as it vanished in another direction, and Dantès slumped back onto his stool. Finally, at around 10 o'clock in the evening, just as he was starting to lose hope, he heard a new sound that, this time, really did seem to be coming towards his cell. And, indeed, there were steps in the corridor that halted in front of his door. A key turned in the lock, the bolts creaked, and the huge mass of oak moved open, suddenly filling the room with the dazzling light of 2 torches, in which Dantès could see the shining sabres and muskets of 4 gendarmes. He had taken 2 steps forward, but stopped in his tracks at the sight of this increased force. "Have you come for me?" he asked. "Yes," one of the gendarmes replied. "On behalf of Monsieur the Deputy Crown Prosecutor?" "I suppose so." "Very well," Dantès said. "I am ready to go with you." Certain that it was Monsieur de Villefort who had sent for him, the unfortunate young man had no apprehension and went out calmly, with easy steps, to station himself between the soldiers who formed his escort. A carriage was waiting at the street door. The driver was on his seat, and there was a police officer sitting beside him. "Has this carriage come for me?" Dantès asked. "It's for you," one of the gendarmes replied. "Get in." Dantès wanted to say something, but the door opened and he felt a shove. He had neither the opportunity to resist nor any intention of doing so. At once he found himself seated inside the carriage between 2 gendarmes, while the 2 others took their place on the bench at the front, and the heavy vehicle began to move forward with a sinister rumble. The prisoner looked at the windows, which were barred. He had merely exchanged one prison for another, with the difference that this one was moving and taking him to some unknown destination. However, through the bars, which were so closely set that a hand could barely pass between them, Dantès could observe that they were proceeding down the Rue Cassière, then the Rue Saint-Laurent and the Rue Taramis, heading towards the port. Soon, through his own bars and those of the monument beside which they had stopped, he saw the bright lights of the detention barracks. The carriage stopped. The police officer got down and went across to the guardroom. A dozen soldiers emerged and formed ranks. Dantès could see their rifles shining in the reflection from the dockside lamps. Can it be for me, he wondered, that they are deploying all those men? The officer unlocked the door, and in doing so, answered his question without speaking a word, for Dantes could see that a path had been opened for him between the two lines of soldiers, leading down to the quayside. The two gendarmes who were sitting on the front bench got out first, then he himself was taken out, followed by those who had been sitting beside him. They set off towards a dinghy that a boatman of the customs was holding against the quay by a chain. The soldiers watched Dantes go past with a look of dumb curiosity. In an instant he was placed in the stern of the boat, still between the four gendarmes, while the officer stood in the bow. With a violent shudder the boat was pushed away from the quay, and four oarsmen began to row vigorously towards the Pion. At a cry from the boat, the chain across the entrance to the port was lowered, and Dantes found himself in the area known as the Frioul, that is to say, outside the harbour. The prisoner's first reaction at finding himself outside had been one of joy. The open air was almost freedom. He drew deep breaths to fill his lungs with the sharp breeze that carries on its wings all the unknown perfumes of the night and the sea. Soon, however, he sighed. They were rowing in front of the same réserve where he had been so happy that very morning in the hour before his arrest, and through two brightly lit windows he could hear the merry sounds of a ball drifting towards him. He clasped his hands together, raised his eyes to heaven, and prayed. The boat continued on its way. It had passed by the Tête du Mort and was opposite the cove of the Pharaoh. It was about to round the battery, and this Dantes could not understand. "But where are you taking me?" he asked one of the gendarmes. "You will know soon enough." "But even so, we are not allowed to tell you anything." Being half a soldier himself, Dantes knew that it was ridiculous to ask questions of subordinates who had been forbidden to reply, so he kept silent. However, the strangest ideas crowded through his brain. Since they could not go far in a boat of this size, and there was no ship at anchor in the direction towards which they were heading, he thought that they must be going to put him ashore on some distant part of the coast and tell him he was free. He was not bound, and no attempt had been made to handcuff him. This seemed like a good sign. In any case, had not the deputy prosecutor told him that, provided he did not mention the dread name of Noirtier, he had nothing to fear? Had not Villefort, in his very presence, destroyed the dangerous letter which was the only proof they had against him? So he waited, silent and deep in thought, trying to penetrate the blackness of night with his sailor's eye, accustomed to darkness and familiar with space. On their right, they had left behind the Île Ratormont, with its lighthouse, and almost following the line of the coast, they had arrived opposite the bay of the Catalans. Here the prisoner looked with still greater intensity. Here Mercedes lived, and he felt at every instant that he could see the vague and ill-defined shape of a woman on the dark shore. Was it possible that Mercedes had been warned by some presentiment that her lover was going by, only 300 yards away? There was only one light burning in the Catalan village. By studying its position, Dantes realized that it came from his fiancée's room. Mercedes was the only person still awake in the whole of the little colony. If the young man were to shout loudly, his fiancée might hear him. But a false feeling of shame prevented him. What would these men who were watching him say if he cried out like a madman? So he stayed silent, staring at the light. Meanwhile the boat continued on its way, but the prisoner was not thinking about the boat. He was thinking of Mercedes. The light disappeared behind a small hill. Dantes turned around and noticed that they were making for the open sea. While he had been looking ashore, taken up with his thoughts, sails had been substituted for the oars, and the boat was now being driven before the wind. Despite his reluctance to ask the gendarme any further questions, Dantes moved over to him and took his hand. "Comrade," he said. "In the name of your conscience and as a soldier, I beg you to have pity on me and to give me an answer. I am Captain Dantes, a good and loyal Frenchman, even though I have been accused of I know not what act of treason. Where are you taking me? Tell me, and I swear as a sailor that I will answer to the call of duty and resign myself to my fate." The gendarme scratched his ear and looked at his fellow. The latter made a sign that roughly indicated, "Since we have gone this far, I see no objection," and the gendarme turned back to Dantes. "You are a Marseillaise and a sailor, and you ask me where we are going?" "Yes, because on my honour I don't know." "You haven't guessed?" "Not at all." "That's not possible." "I swear by all that is most sacred to me in the world. I beg you, tell me." "What about my instructions?" "Your instructions do not forbid you to inform me of something that I shall know in 10 minutes, or half an hour, or perhaps an hour. Yet between now and then you can spare me centuries of uncertainty. I ask this of you as though you were my friend. Look, I'm not trying to resist or to escape. In any case, it would be impossible. Where are we going?" "Unless you are blindfolded or you have never been outside the port of Marseille, then you must surely guess where you are going." "No." "But look around you." Dantes got up and naturally turned his eyes to the point towards which the boat appeared to be heading. Some 200 yards in front of them loomed the sheer black rock from which, like a flinty excrescence, rises the Chateau d'If. To Dantes, who had not been thinking about it at all, the sudden appearance of this strange shape, this prison shrouded in such deep terror, this fortress which for 3 centuries has nourished Marseille with its gloomy legends, had the same effect as the spectacle of the scaffold on a condemned man. "My God!" he cried. "The Chateau d'If! Why are we going there?" The gendarme smiled. "You can't be taking me to incarcerate me there," Dantes continued. "The Chateau d'If is a state prison, meant only for major political criminals. I haven't committed any crime. Are there examining magistrates or any other sort of judges in the Chateau d'If?" "As far as I know, only a governor, jailers, a garrison and solid walls. Come now, my friend, don't be so surprised, or I'll think you are showing your gratitude for my indulgence by making fun of me." Dantes grasped the gendarme's hand with crushing force. "Are you telling me then that I am being taken to the Chateau d'If to be imprisoned there?" "Seems like it," said the gendarme. "But in any case, my friend, it won't do you any good to grip my hands so tightly." "Without any further inquiry or formalities?" the young man asked. "The formalities have been gone through and the inquiry made." "Like that, despite Monsieur de Villefort's promise?" "I don't know what Monsieur de Villefort promised you," said the gendarme. "All I do know is that we're going to the Chateau d'If. Hey there, what are you doing? Hold on, give me a hand here." With a movement as swift as lightning, though not swift enough even so to escape the gendarme's practised eye, Dantes tried to leap overboard, but was held back just as his feet left the planks of the boat, into which he fell back, screaming furiously. "Fine!" the gendarme exclaimed, kneeling on his chest. "Fine! So that is how you keep your word as a sailor. Still waters run deep. Well now, my good friend, make a single movement, just one, and I'll put a shot in your head. I disobeyed my first instruction, but I guarantee you that I shall not fail to abide by the second." He gave every indication of his intention to carry out his threat, lowering his musket until Dantes could feel the barrel pressing against his temple. For an instant he considered making the forbidden movement, and so putting a violent end to the misfortune that had swooped down and suddenly seized him in its vulture's grip. But precisely because the misfortune was so unexpected, Dantes felt that it could not be long-lasting. Then he remembered Monsieur de Villefort's promises, and finally it must be admitted that death in the bilge of an open boat at the hands of a gendarme struck him as ugly and grim. So he fell back onto the planks of the vessel with a cry of rage, gnawing at his fists in his fury. Almost at the same moment, the boat shook violently. One of the oarsmen leapt on the rock that had just struck against its prow. A rope groaned as it unwound from a pulley, and Dantes realised that they had arrived, and the skiff was being moored. His guards, holding him simultaneously by his arms and the collar of his jacket, forced him to get up, obliged him to go ashore, and dragged him towards the steps leading up to the gate of the fortress, while the officer took up the rear, armed with a musket and bayonet. In any case, Dantes did not attempt to struggle pointlessly. His slowness was the result of inertia rather than resistance. He stumbled dizzily like a drunken man. Once more he could see soldiers lined up along the steep embankment. He felt the steps obliging him to lift his feet, and noticed that he was passing beneath a gateway, and that the gate was closing behind him. But all of this in a daze, as if through a mist, without clearly perceiving anything. He could no longer even distinguish the sea, that vast sorrow of prisoners who stare into space with the awful feeling that they are powerless to cross it. There was a momentary pause, during which he tried to gather his wits. He looked around him. He was in a square courtyard, enclosed within 4 high walls. He could hear the slow, regular footfalls of the sentries, and each time they passed in front of the 2 or 3 reflections cast on the walls by the light of as many lamps burning inside the castle, it reflected on the muzzles of their guns. They waited there for about 10 minutes. Certain that Dantes could not escape, the gendarmes had released their hold on him. They appeared to be waiting for orders, which eventually came. "Where is the prisoner?" asked a voice. "Here," one of the gendarmes replied. "Let him follow me. I'll conduct him to his cell." "Come on," the gendarme said, shoving Dantes forward. The prisoner followed his guide, who led him into a room that was nearly underground, its bare, dripping walls seemingly impregnated with a vapour of tears. A species of lamp on a wooden stool, its wick drowning in fetid oil, lit the shining walls of this appalling abode, and showed Dantes his guide, a sort of subordinate jailer, poorly dressed and coarse-featured. "Here is your room for tonight," he said. "It is late, and the governor has gone to bed. Tomorrow, when he wakes up and can examine his instructions concerning you, he may move you elsewhere. Meanwhile, here is some bread. You have water in that jar, and straw over there in the corner. That is all a prisoner can want. Good night to you." Before Dantes could open his mouth to reply, let alone see where the jailer was putting the bread, or the place where the jar stood, and look over to the corner where the straw was waiting to make him a bed, the jailer had taken the lamp, and, shutting the door, denied the prisoner even the dim light that had shown him, as though in a flash of lightning, the streaming walls of his prison. So he found himself alone, in the silence and darkness, as black and noiseless as the icy cold of the vaults which he could feel pressing down on his feverish brow. When the first rays of dawn started to bring a little light into this den, the jailer returned with orders to leave the prisoner where he was. Dantes had not moved. An iron hand seemed to have nailed him to the very spot where he had stopped the night before. Only his deep-set eyes were now hidden behind the swelling caused by the moisture of his tears. He was motionless, staring at the floor. He had spent the whole night in this way, standing, and not sleeping for an instant. The jailer came over to him and walked round him, but Dantes appeared not to notice. He tapped him on the shoulder, and Dantes shuddered and shook his head. "Haven't you slept?" asked the jailer. "I don't know," Dantes replied. The jailer looked at him in astonishment. "Aren't you hungry?" "I don't know," Dantes replied again. "Do you want anything?" "I want to see the governor." The jailer shrugged his shoulders and went out. Dantes looked after him, stretched his hands out towards the half-open door, but it was closed again. At this his chest seemed to be torn apart by a profound sob. The tears that filled it burst out like 2 streams. He fell down, pressed his face to the ground and prayed for a long time, mentally going through the whole of his past life and wondering what crime he had committed in so brief a span that could merit such cruel punishment. So the day was spent. He ate hardly more than a few mouthfuls of bread and drank a few drops of water. At times he remained seated, wrapped in thought. At others he paced around his prison like a wild animal trapped in an iron cage. One thought struck him with particular force. It was this, that during the crossing, when, not knowing where they were taking him, he had remained so calm and docile, there had been a dozen times when he could have jumped overboard, and, once in the water, thanks to an ability that made him one of the most skillful divers in Marseille, have vanished beneath the waves, evaded his captors, reached the shore, fled, hidden in some deserted bay, waited for a Genoese or Catalan ship, gone to Italy or Spain, and from there written to Mercedes to join him. As for a livelihood, he had no misgivings in any country. Good sailors are everywhere in short supply. He spoke Italian like a Tuscan and Spanish like a son of old Castile. He would have lived in freedom, happy with Mercedes and with his father, because his father would come to join them. Yet here he was, a prisoner, shut up in this impregnable fortress in the Chateau d'If, not knowing what had become of his father, or what had become of Mercedes, and all because he had trusted Villefort's word. Dantès thought he would go mad, and he rolled in fury on the fresh straw that his jailer had brought him. The following day, at the same hour, the jailer came in. "Well," he asked, "are you in a more reasonable frame of mind than yesterday?" Dantès did not answer. "Come now, pull yourself together. Is there anything you need that I can get you? Tell me." "I want to speak to the governor." "Pah!" the jailer said impatiently. "I've already told you that's impossible." "Why is it impossible?" "Because under the prison regulations a prisoner is not allowed to make that request." "And what is allowed here?" Dantès asked. "Better food if you pay, walks, and sometimes books." "I have no need of books. I have no desire to walk, and my food suits me well, so there is only one thing I want, which is to see the governor." "If you get on my nerves by repeating the same thing over and over," said the jailer, "I shall stop bringing you any food at all." "Well then," said Dantès, if you do not bring me anything to eat, I shall starve." The tone of Dantès' voice as he said this showed the jailer that his prisoner would be happy to die, and as every prisoner, when all is said and done, represents roughly 10 sous a day for his jailer, the man considered the loss that he would suffer from Dantès' death, and continued in milder vein, "Listen, what you want is impossible, so don't ask for it again. It is unheard of for the governor to come into a cell at a prisoner's request. But behave well and you will be allowed to exercise, and one day while you are in the exercise yard, the governor may go by. Then you can talk to him. It is his business whether he wishes to reply." "But how long," Dantès asked, "am I likely to wait before this occurs?" "Who knows? A month, 3 months, 6, perhaps a year." "That's too long," said Dantès. "I want to see him at once." "Oh, don't get obsessed by one single thing that is impossible to obtain. Otherwise in a fortnight you'll be mad." "Do you think so?" "Quite mad. That is always how madness begins. We have an example right here. It was because he kept on offering 1,000,000 francs to the governor if he would set him free that the abbé who occupied this cell before you went off his head." "How long is it since he left this cell?" 2 years. "And was he freed?" "No, put in a dungeon." "Listen," Dantès said, "I am not an abbé, nor am I mad. Perhaps I shall become so, but alas, for the moment I have all my wits. I want to make another suggestion to you." "What?" "I won't offer you 1,000,000 because I could not give it to you. But if you want, I shall offer you 100 écus so that, next time you cross to Marseille, you will go to the Catalan and give a letter to a young woman called Mercedes. Not even a letter, just a couple of lines. If I were to carry 2 lines and I was caught, I should lose my job, which is worth 1,000 livres a year, without food and bonuses, so you could see I would be a fine fool if I were to risk losing 1,000 livres to make 300. Well, Dantes said, listen to me and mark what I say. If you refuse to carry 2 lines to Mercedes, or at least to let her know that I am here, I shall wait for you one day, hiding behind my door, and as soon as you enter, crack your head open with this stool. Threats? The jailer exclaimed, taking a step back and putting himself on his guard. You really are losing your mind. The abbé started the same way. In 3 days you'll be raving mad as he is. Luckily there are dungeons in the Chateau d'If. Dantes took the stool and swung it around his head. Very well, said the jailer. Since you insist, it will be reported to the governor. At last, Dantes said, putting the stool down on the floor and sitting on it, wild-eyed, hanging his head as if he had truly become insane. The jailer left, and a moment later returned with 3 soldiers and a corporal. By order of the governor, he said, take this prisoner to the floor below. You mean to the dungeons? Said the corporal. To the dungeons. The mad must go with the mad. The 4 soldiers seized Dantes, who fell into a sort of catatonia, and followed them without trying to resist. He was led down 15 steps, and they opened the door of a dungeon which he entered, muttering, Quite correct, the mad must go with the mad. The door closed, and Dantes walked straight ahead, his arms outstretched, until he touched the wall. Then he sat down in a corner and remained motionless, while his eyes, gradually becoming accustomed to the gloom, started to make out his surroundings. The jailer had been right. Dantes was very close to madness. Chapter 9. The evening of the betrothal. Villefort, as we mentioned, had set out to return to the Place du Grand Cour, and on arriving back at the house of Madame de Saint-Méran, discovered that the guests he had left at table were now taking coffee in the drawing-room. Renée was waiting for him with an impatience shared by the rest of the company, and he was greeted with general acclaim. "How now, head-cutter, pillar of the state, royalist Brutus!" cried one. "Tell us what's up." "Yes, are we threatened with a new reign of terror?" asked another. "Has the Corsican ogre come forth from his cave?" asked a third. "Madame la Marquise," said Villefort, going over to his future mother-in-law, "I have come to ask you to excuse me for being obliged to leave you in this way. Marquis, could I beg the favour of a word or two in private?" "Oh, so it really is serious?" the Marquise asked, seeing the cloud that had settled on Villefort's brow. "So much so that I have to take leave of you for a few days." He turned towards Renée. "So you can understand that the matter must be serious indeed." "You're going away?" Renée exclaimed, unable to hide her feelings at this unexpected news. "Alas, mademoiselle, I must," Villefort replied. "And where are you going?" the Marquise asked. "That, madame, must remain a secret under the law. However, if anyone here has some message for Paris, one of my friends is leaving for there tonight and will be delighted to undertake the errand." Everybody exchanged glances. "You asked for a moment of my time?" the Marquis said. "Yes, if you please, let us go into your study." The Marquis took Villefort's arm and they went out. "Now, tell me what this is about," he asked when they reached the study. "Something that I believe to be of the utmost importance, which requires my immediate departure for Paris. Marquis, excuse my bluntness and indiscretion, but do you have any government stock?" "My whole fortune is in bonds, around 600,000 or 700,000 francs." "Then sell them, Marquis. Sell them or you are ruined." "But how can I sell them from here?" "You have a broker, don't you?" "Yes." "Give me a letter for him, so that he can sell without losing a minute or even a second. Even so, I may be too late." "Damn!" the Marquis exclaimed. "Let's not waste time." He sat down at a table and wrote a letter to his broker, instructing him to sell at any price. "Now that I have this letter," Villefort said, folding it and putting it carefully into his pocket-book, "I need another." "For whom?" "For the king." "The king?" "Yes." "But I dare not take it upon myself to write to his majesty." "I am not asking you to do so yourself, but to request it of Monsieur de Salvieux. He must give me a letter that will allow me to approach his majesty without having to go through all the formalities of requesting an audience, which might waste valuable time." "What about the Lord Chancellor, who has free access to the Tuileries? Through him you could contact the king at any time of the day or night." "No doubt, but why should someone else share the credit for the news that I carry? Do you follow me? The Chancellor would naturally relegate me to a subordinate role and deprive me of any benefit I might obtain in the matter. I can tell you only one thing, Marquis. My career is guaranteed if I can arrive first at the Tuileries, because I shall have done the king a service that he will be unable to forget." "In that case, dear boy, go and pack. I shall call de Salvieux and ask him to write a letter that will act as your passport to his majesty. Pray lose no time, for I must be in my chaise within a quarter of an hour. Have the carriage draw up in front of the door. Of course, please make my excuses to the Marquise, and to Mademoiselle de Saint-Marin, for whom, today of all days, I part with the profoundest regret. They will both be waiting in the study for you to make your own farewells. Thank you 100 times. Look after my letter." The Marquis rang, and a servant appeared. "Tell Comte de Salvieux that I am expecting him. Now, you must go," he added to Villefort. "I shall be back immediately." Villefort ran out, but, on reaching the door, realized that the sight of a deputy crown prosecutor in such a hurry could upset the tranquillity of an entire town, so he slowed to his normal pace, which was quite magisterial. At his front door he saw a pale, ghost-like figure waiting for him, upright and motionless in the shadows. It was the lovely young Catalan, who, having no news of Edmund, had slipped out of the district around the Faro at nightfall to come in person and see if she could discover the reasons for her lover's arrest. When Villefort approached, she stepped out of the shadow of the wall against which she was leaning and barred his path. Dantès had told the prosecutor about his fiancée, and Villefort recognized Mercedes without her giving her name. He was surprised at the beauty and dignity of the woman, and when she asked him what had become of her lover, he felt as though he was the defendant and she was the judge. "The man of whom you speak," he replied brusquely, "is a major criminal, and I can do nothing for him, mademoiselle." Mercedes could not repress a sob, and, as Villefort tried to go past, stopped him again. "At least tell me where he is, so that I can find out if he is alive or dead." "I don't know. He is no longer my responsibility," Villefort replied. And, embarrassed by her keen look and attitude of entreaty, he pushed Mercedes aside and went in, slamming the door as though to shut out the sorrow that she had brought him. But sorrow is not so easily put aside. The stricken man carried it with him like the fatal stamp of which Virgil speaks. Villefort went in and closed the door, but when he reached the living-room, his legs too gave way beneath him. He let out a sigh that was more like a sob, and slumped into a chair. Now, in the depths of that sick heart, the first seeds of a mortal abscess begin to spread. That man whom he was sacrificing to his own ambition, that innocent man who was paying the price for the guilt of Villefort's father, appeared before him, pale and menacing, clasping the hand of a fiancée who was no less pale, and bearing remorse in his train. Not the remorse that makes its victims leap up like a Roman raging against his fate, but that bitter, muffled blow that intermittently chimes on the soul and sears it with the memory of some past action, an agonizing wound that lacerates deeper and deeper until death. Even now there was a moment's hesitation in his heart. Many times before he had called for the death penalty with no more emotion than that aroused by the contest between the accuser and the accused, and these convicts who had gone to their deaths because of the thundering eloquence with which he had convinced the judges or the jury had left no shadow on his brow. They had been guilty, or at least so Villefort believed. This time, however, it was a different matter. He had just condemned a man to perpetual incarceration, but an innocent man, poised on the brink of good fortune, depriving him not only of freedom, but also of happiness. He was not a judge this time, but an executioner. And when he thought of that, he felt the muffled blow that we described, something that he had not previously experienced, sounding in the depths of his heart and filling his breast with a vague feeling of apprehension. Thus a wounded man will be put on his guard by a powerful and instinctive prescience of pain, and tremble whenever his finger approaches the site of an open bleeding wound, for as long as it remains unhealed. But the wound that Villefort had suffered was one that would not heal, or one that would close, only to reopen more bloody and painful than before. If at that moment René's sweet voice had sounded in his ear calling for clemency, or if the lovely Mercedes had come in and said, "In the name of the God who sees us and judges us, give me back my betrothed," then surely that brow, already half prepared to submit to the inevitable, would have bent altogether, and he would no doubt have taken the pen in his numbed fingers and, despite the risk to himself, signed the order to set Dantès free. But no voice spoke in the silence, and the door opened only to Villefort's valet de chambre, who had come to tell him that the post-horses were harnessed up to his barouche. He got up, or rather leapt up, like a man resolving some inner struggle, ran across to his writing desk, emptied the gold from one of its drawers into his pockets, paced distractedly around his room for a moment, with his hand on his forehead, muttering incomprehensibly. Then, at last, feeling the coat which his valet had just put across his shoulders, went out, sprang into his carriage, and snapped out the order to stop off at Monsieur de Saint-Marin's in the Rue de Grand Cour. The sentence on the unhappy Dantès was confirmed. As Monsieur de Saint-Marin had promised, Villefort found the Marquise and René in the study. The young man shuddered on seeing René, thinking that she might once more ask him to free Dantès. But alas, it must be said, to the discredit of self-centered humankind, that the beautiful young woman was concerned with only one thing: Villefort's departure. She loved Villefort, and he was leaving at the very moment when he was about to become her husband. He could not tell her when he would return, and René, instead of feeling pity for Dantès, was cursing the man whose crime was the cause of her separation from her lover. So there was nothing that Mercedes could say. On the corner of the Rue de la Loge, poor Mercedes had met Fernand, who was following her. She had returned to Le Catalan and thrown herself on her bed in an extremity of desperation. Fernand knelt beside the bed, and clasping an icy hand that Mercedes did not think to take from him, covered it with ardent kisses that Mercedes did not even feel. So she spent the night. The lamp went out when the oil was exhausted, but she no more noticed the darkness than she had noticed the light. When day returned, she was unaware of that also. Sorrow had covered her eyes with a blindfold that showed her only Edmund. "Ah, it's you," she said, finally, turning towards Fernand. "I have not left your side since yesterday," he replied with a pitiful sigh. Monsieur Morel would not admit defeat. He had learned that Dantès had been taken to prison after being questioned, so he hastened to see all his friends and visit anyone in Marseille who might have some influence there. But already the rumour was spreading that the young man had been arrested as a Bonapartist agent. Since at that time even the most daring considered any attempt by Napoleon to recover the throne as an insane fantasy, Monsieur Morel was greeted everywhere with indifference, fear, or rejection, and returned home in despair, admitting that the position was serious and that no one could do anything about it. Caderousse, for his part, was deeply disturbed and troubled. Instead of following Monsieur Morel's example, going out and attempting to do something for Dantès, which was in any case impossible, he shut himself in with 2 bottles of cassis and tried to drown his anxiety in drunkenness. But such was his state of mind that 2 bottles were not enough to extinguish his thoughts, so he remained, too drunk to fetch any more wine, not drunk enough to forget, seated in front of his 2 empty bottles, with his elbows on a rickety table, watching all the spectres that Hoffmann scattered across manuscripts moist with punch, dancing like a cloud of fantastic black dust in the shadows thrown by his long-wicked candle. Danglars was alone, but neither troubled nor disturbed. Danglars was even happy, because he had taken revenge on an enemy and ensured himself the place on board the Pharaon that he had feared he might lose. Danglars was one of those calculating men who are born with a pen behind their ear and an inkwell instead of a heart. To him, everything in this world was subtraction or multiplication, and a numeral was much dearer than a man, when it was a numeral that would increase the total, while a man might reduce it. So Danglars had gone to bed at his usual hour and slept peacefully. Villefort, after receiving the letter from Monsieur de Salvieux, had embraced Renée on both cheeks, kissed the hand of Madame de Saint-Marin, and shaken that of the Marquis, and was travelling post-haste along the road for Aix. Dantès' father was perishing from grief and anxiety. As for Edmond, we know what had become of him. Chapter 10. The Little Cabinet in the Tuileries. Let us leave Villefort going hell for leather down the road to Paris, having paid for extra horses at every stage, and proceed him through the 2 or 3 rooms into the little cabinet at the Tuileries, with its arched window, famous for having been the favourite study of Napoleon and King Louis XVIII, and today for being that of King Louis Philippe. Here, seated in front of a walnut table that he had brought back from Hartwell, to which, by one of those foibles usual among great men, he was especially partial, King Louis XVIII was listening without particular attention to a man of between 50 and 52 years, grey-haired, with aristocratic features and meticulously turned out, while at the same time making marginal notes in a volume of Horace, the Gryphius edition, much admired, but often inaccurate, which used to contribute more than a little to His Majesty's learned observations on philology. "You were saying, monsieur," the king asked, "that I feel deeply disquieted, sire." "Really? Have you by any chance dreamt of 7 fat and 7 lean cows?" "No, sire, for that would only presage only 7 years of fertility and 7 of famine, and with a king as far-sighted as your majesty, we need have no fear of famine." "So what other scourge might afflict us, my dear Blacas?" "I have every reason to believe, sire, that there is a storm brewing from the direction of the south." "And I, my dear Duke," replied Louis XVIII, "think you are very ill-informed, because I know for a fact that, on the contrary, the weather down there is excellent." Despite being a man of some wit, Louis XVIII liked to indulge a facile sense of humour. "Sire," Monsieur de Blacas continued, "if only to reassure his faithful servant, might your majesty not send some trusty men to Languedoc, to Provence and the Dauphine, to give him a report on the feeling of those provinces?" "Canemus surdis," the king replied, carrying on with the annotation of his Horace. The courtier laughed, to give the impression that he understood the phrase from the poet of Venusia. "Your majesty may well be perfectly correct to trust in the loyalty of the French, but I think I may not be altogether wrong to anticipate some desperate adventure." "By whom?" "By Bonaparte, or at least those of his faction." "My dear Blacas," said the king, "you are interrupting my work with your horrid tales." "And you, sire, are keeping me from my sleep with fears for your safety." One moment, my good friend, wait 1 moment. I have here a most perspicacious note on the line Pastor quum trahiret. Let me finish it and you can tell me afterwards. There was a brief silence while Louis XVIII, in handwriting that he made as tiny as possible, wrote a new note in the margin of his Horace. Then, when the note was written, he looked up with the satisfied air of a man who thinks he has made a discovery when he has commented on someone else's idea, and said, "Carry on, my dear Duke, carry on, I am listening." "Sire," said Blacas, who had briefly hoped to use Villefort to his own advantage, "I have to tell you that this news that troubles me is not some vague whisper. These are no mere unfounded rumours. A right-thinking man who has my entire confidence and was required by me to keep watch on the south," the Duke hesitated as he said this, "has just arrived post-haste to tell me that there is a great danger threatening the king. And so, sire, I came at once." "Mala ducis avidomum," Louis XVIII continued, making another note. "Is your Majesty ordering to say no more on this topic?" "No, my dear Duke, but stretch out your hand." "Which one?" "Whichever you prefer. Over there on the left." "Here, sire?" "I tell you the left and you look on the right. I mean my left. There you have it. You should find a report from the Minister of Police with yesterday's date. But here is Monsieur d'André himself. You did say Monsieur d'André, didn't you?" Louis XVIII remarked, turning to the usher who had indeed just announced the Minister of Police. "Yes, sire, Monsieur le Baron d'André," the usher repeated. "That's it, Baron," Louis XVIII continued with a faint smile. "Come in, Baron, and tell the Duke your most recent news about Monsieur de Bonaparte. Conceal nothing from us, however serious the situation may be. Let's see. Is not the island of Elba a volcano? And shall we see war burst from it, bristling and blazing? Bella, horrida, bella!" Monsieur d'André leant elegantly against the back of a chair, resting both hands upon it, and said, "Was your Majesty good enough to consult my report on yesterday's date?" "Yes, of course, but tell the Duke what was in this report, because he is unable to find it. Let him know everything that the usurper is doing on his island." "Monsieur," the Baron said to the Duke, "all His Majesty's servants should applaud the latest news that we have received from Elba. Bonaparte—" Monsieur d'André turned to Louis XVIII, who was busy writing a note and did not even look up. "Bonaparte," the Baron continued, "is bored to death. He spends whole days watching his miners at work in Porto Logon. And he scratches himself as a distraction," said the king. "He scratches himself?" the Duke said. "What does your Majesty mean?" "Yes, indeed, my dear Duke. Have you forgotten that this great man, this hero, this demigod, is driven to distraction by a skin ailment?" "There is more, Monsieur le Duc," said the Minister of Police. "We are almost certain that the usurper will shortly be mad." "Mad?" "Utterly. His head is softening. Sometimes he weeps bitterly. At others he laughs hysterically. On some occasions he spends hours sitting on the shore playing at ducks and drakes, and when a pebble makes 5 or 6 leaps, he seems as satisfied as though he had won another battle of Marengo or Austerlitz. You must agree that these are signs of folly." "Or of wisdom, Monsieur le Baron, or of wisdom," said Louis XVIII with a laugh. "The great captains of antiquity used to replenish their spirits by playing at ducks and drakes. See Plutarch's Life of Scipio Africanus." Monsieur de Blacas was left speechless between these two forms of unconcern. Villefort, who had not wished to tell him everything in order to prevent anyone else from taking away all the advantage that he might gain from his secret, had none the less told him enough to make him very anxious. "Go on, d'André, go on," said Louis XVIII. "Blacas is not yet convinced. Tell him about the usurper's conversion." The Minister of Police bowed. "The usurper's conversion?" muttered the Duke, looking from the king to d'André, who was speaking their parts alternately like two Virgilian shepherds. "Has the usurper been converted?" "Absolutely, my dear Duke." "To the right principles. Explain it, Baron." "Here's the truth of the matter, Duke," the minister said with the greatest gravity in the world. "Napoleon recently reviewed his men, and when 2 or 3 of his old grognards, as he called them, expressed a wish to return to France, he gave them leave and urged them to serve their good king. Those were his own words, Monsieur le Duc, I am assured of it." "So now, Blacas, what do you think?" the king asked triumphantly, turning his attention for a moment from the scholarly tome that lay open beside him. "I say, sire, that either the Minister of Police is mistaken or I am. But since it is impossible for it to be the Minister of Police who is responsible for preserving your Majesty's safety and honour, then I am probably the one who is wrong. However, sire, in your Majesty's place I should wish to question the person about whom I spoke. I would even insist that your Majesty do him this honour." "Certainly, Duke. At your insistence I shall receive whomever you wish, but I should like to do so fully armed. Minister, do you yet have a more recent report than this one? This is dated February the 20th, and it is now already March the 3rd. "No, sire, but I have been expecting one at any minute. I have been out since early this morning, and it may have arrived in my absence." "Go to the prefecture, and if there is not one there," Louis XVIII continued, laughing, "make one. Isn't that the procedure?" "Oh, sire," the minister exclaimed, "thank heaven on that score there is no need to invent anything. Each day brings the most circumstantial denunciations pouring into our offices, the work of a host of miserable wretches who are hoping for a little gratitude for services that they do not render much as they would like to. They wager on chance, in the hope that one day an unexpected event will give some sort of reality to their predictions." "Very well. Then go, monsieur," Louis XVIII said, "and remember that I shall be awaiting your return." "I shall not tarry, sire. I shall return in 10 minutes. "And I, sire, shall go and fetch my messenger," said Blacas. Wait, Louis XVIII said. "Blacas, I really must change your coat of arms. I shall give you an eagle with wings extended, grasping in its claws a prey that is trying in vain to escape, with this device, tenax." "I am listening, sire," said Monsieur de Blacas, wringing his hands in impatience. "I should like to consult you about this text, Molly Fugien's Angelitu. You know, it concerns the stag fleeing the wolf. You are a great huntsman, I believe, and an expert on wolves. In both these capacities, what do you think of this Molly Angelitu?" "Admirable, sire, but my messenger is like the stag that you mention, for he has just covered 200 leagues by road in barely 3 days." "He has expended a lot of energy and a lot of trouble, my dear Duke, when we have the telegraph that only takes 3 or 4 hours, and does so without making one in the slightest bit out of breath. Sire, this is meagre reward for a poor young man who has come so far and with such ardour to give your Majesty some important news. If only for the sake of Monsieur de Salvieux, who has recommended him to me, I beg you to receive him well." "Monsieur de Salvieux, my brother's chamberlain?" "The same. But he is in Marseille. He writes to me from there." "Does he too speak to you of this conspiracy?" "No, but he recommends Monsieur de Villefort to me and instructs me to bring him into your Majesty's presence." "Monsieur de Villefort!" cried the king. "Is this messenger called Monsieur de Villefort?" "Yes, sire. And he is the one who has come from Marseille. In person." "Why did you not tell me his name at once?" the king asked, a faint shadow of anxiety appearing on his face. "Sire, I thought that your Majesty would not know the name." "Not so, Blacas, not so. He is a serious young man, well bred and above all ambitious. And, heavens, do you know his father's name?" "His father? Yes, Noirtier." "Noirtier the Girondin? Noirtier the senator?" "Precisely." "And your Majesty has given employment to the son of such a man?" "Blacas, my friend, you understand nothing. I told you that Villefort was ambitious. To make his way, Villefort will sacrifice everything, even his father." "So should I let him enter, sire?" "This very moment, Duke. Where is he?" "He must be waiting for me below in my carriage." "Go and fetch him. Immediately." The Duke left with the vivacity of a young man, the warmth of his sincere royalism taking 20 years off his age. Left alone, Louis XVIII turned back to his half-open Horace and murmured, "Justum et tenacem proposti virum." Monsieur de Blacas came back up the stairs as fast as he had gone down, but in the antechamber he was obliged to appeal to the king's authority. Villefort's dusty coat and his general appearance, bearing no relation to the dress of the court, had offended the sensibilities of Monsieur de Brezé, who was astonished that any young man should have the audacity to appear in such clothing before the king. But the Duke brushed aside his objections with a single phrase, "His Majesty's orders," and, though the Master of Ceremonies continued to mutter his objections for form's sake, Villefort was ushered into the royal presence. The king was sitting exactly where the Duke had left him. On opening the door, Villefort found himself directly opposite him, and the young lawyer's first impulse was to stop dead. "Come in, Monsieur de Villefort," the king said. "Come in." Villefort bowed and took a few steps forward, waiting for the king to question him. "Monsieur de Villefort," the king went on, "the Duc de Blacas claims that you have something important to tell us." "Sire, the Duke is right, and I hope that your Majesty will acknowledge the same." "Firstly, before anything else, monsieur, is the problem as serious in your opinion as I have been led to believe?" "Sire, I believe that it is urgent, but I hope that, thanks to my efforts, it will not be irreparable." "Take as long as you wish, monsieur," said the king, who was starting to succumb to the feelings that he had seen on Monsieur de Blacas's face, and which he heard in the strained tones of Villefort's voice. "Speak, and above all begin at the beginning. I like order in all things." "Sire," said Villefort, "I shall give your Majesty a faithful account, but I beg you to excuse me if, in my eagerness, I am unable to give as clear account as I should wish." A rapid glance at the king after this ingratiating preface reassured Villefort on the benevolence of his august listener, and he continued. "Sire, I have driven post-haste to Paris to inform your Majesty that, in the course of my duties, I have discovered not one of those commonplace and inconsequential plots, the like of which are hatched daily in the lower ranks of the people and of the army, but a veritable conspiracy, a whirlwind that threatens the very throne on which your Majesty sits. The usurper is fitting out 3 ships. He is contemplating some adventure that may perhaps be senseless, but none the less fearsome for all that. At this very moment he has surely left Elba. To go where? I do not know, but certainly with the intention of landing either at Naples or on the coast of Tuscany, or even in France. Your Majesty must know that the ruler of the island of Elba has kept in contact both with Italy and France." "Yes, monsieur, I do know," said the king, deeply troubled. "Quite recently we have been informed that meetings of Bonapartists have taken place in the Rue Saint-Jacques. But pray continue. How did you obtain this information?" "Sire, it is the result of an interrogation that I carried out on a man from Marseille, whom I have had under surveillance for some time and arrested on the day of my departure. This man, a rebellious sailor whose Bonapartist sympathies I suspected, went secretly to the island of Elba. There he met the Grand Marshal, who entrusted him with a verbal message for a Bonapartist in Paris, whose name I was not able to make him divulge. However, the message was that the Bonapartist was ordered to prepare his supporters for a return. You understand, these are the words of the interrogation, sire, for a return that cannot fail to take place shortly." "And where is the man?" Louis XVIII asked. "In prison, sire." "You believe the matter to be serious?" "So much so, sire, that although this event interrupted a family celebration on the very day of my betrothal, I left everything, my fiancé and my friends, putting all aside to hasten to see your Majesty, both to inform you of my fears and to assure you of my loyal devotion." "That's right," said Louis XVIII. "There was some plan that you should marry Mademoiselle de Saint-Marin, wasn't there?" "The daughter of one of your Majesty's most faithful servants." Yes, but let us return to the plot, Monsieur de Villefort." "Sire, I fear that this is no longer merely a plot. I fear we are dealing with a conspiracy." The king smiled, A conspiracy nowadays is an easy matter to contemplate, but harder to put into practice, precisely because, having been recently restored to the throne of our ancestors, we have our eyes fixed on the past, the present, and the future. In the past 10 months, my ministers have been doubly vigilant to ensure that the Mediterranean coast is well protected. If Bonaparte were to land at Naples, the entire coalition would be mobilised against him before he even reached Piombino. If he were to land in Tuscany, he would step onto an enemy shore. If he were to land in France, it would be with a handful of men, and we should easily overcome him, hated as he is by the people. So have no fear, monsieur, but be assured, nonetheless, of our royal gratitude." "Ah, here is Monsieur d'André," the Duc de Blacas exclaimed. At that moment, as he spoke, the Minister of Police appeared at the door, pale, trembling and staring vacantly, as if dazed by a blinding flash of light. Villefort made to retire from the room, but Monsieur de Blacas clasped his hand to restrain him. And on that note, I think I shall take a break. Oh, the plot thickens. Poor old Dantes. And Villefort was just like lying through his teeth. Oof! Ugh, but yes. Everybody go, have a break. Do the thing that the break command says. I hope you're all enjoying it so far. And, oh, excuse me. I shall see you back in about 5 minutes. Goodbye for now. Hello, we are back. I am back with a cup of tea. Because, as the youth say, the tea, what do they say? Something about tea. I was about to say the tea thickens. That's not what people say. That's the cross between the plot thickens. It's like, spill the tea. That's what people say, isn't it? Fancy a tea. Yeah, I think that's what old people say. That's what I say. No, I believe it's spill the tea or something, or the tea is something. I don't know. Basically, plot thickens. Ooh. But I think perfect. Good job. Thank you. Yes, I think my voice is feeling a little tired. What happens when you read 3 hours on Wednesday? So I think I'll probably finish a bit before midnight. So that'll be the break we've just had. Will probably be my only break. But yes, we shall see how far I get before I start getting croaky. But yes, this is. I also realised I accidentally misnumbered the first chapter as chapter 7 when it was actually chapter 8. So I went 7 and then 9 because I can count. Because all the flipping chapters in this are all Roman numerals, so it goes up to like CXV11. It's like 150 something. Anyway, we shall continue after I've taken a sip of tea. I hope everybody has also had a nice break and is comfortable and all of the things. Yes, I'm tired. Right, we shall continue with chapter 11, The Corsican Ogre. Louis XVIII, on seeing this ravaged face, thrust away the table before which he was sitting. "What is wrong with you, Baron?" he cried. "You seem thunderstruck. Do your troubled appearance and hesitant manner have anything to do with what Monsieur de Blacas was saying, and what Monsieur de Villefort has just confirmed to me?" Meanwhile, Monsieur de Blacas had made an urgent movement towards the Baron, but the courtier's terror got the better of the statesman's pride. In such circumstances it was far preferable for him to be humiliated by the prefect of police than to humiliate him in view of what was at stake. "Sire," the Baron stammered. Come. At this, the Minister of Police gave way to an onrush of despair and threw himself at the king's feet. Louis XVIII stepped back, raising his eyebrows. "Won't you say something?" he asked. "Oh, sire, what a terrible misfortune! What will become of me? I shall never recover from it." "Monsieur," Louis XVIII said, "I order you to speak." "Sire, the usurper left Elba on February the 28th and landed on March the 1st. "Where?" the king said urgently. "In France, sire, in a little port on the Gulf Juan, near Antibes." "The usurper landed in France, near Antibes on the Gulf Juan, 200 leagues from Paris, on March the 1st, and it is only today, March the 3rd, that you inform me of it." "Well, monsieur, what you are telling me is impossible. Either you have been misinformed or you are mad." "Alas, sire, it's only too true." Louis XVIII made a gesture of inexpressible anger and alarm, leaping to his feet as though a sudden blow had struck him simultaneously in the heart and across the face. "In France!" he cried. "The usurper in France! But was no one watching the man? Who knows, perhaps you were in league with him." "Sire, no!" the Duc de Blacas cried. "A man like Monsieur d'André could never be accused of treason. We were all blind, sire, and the Minister of Police was as blind as the rest of us, nothing more." "But," Villefort said, and he stopped dead in his tracks. "I beg your forgiveness, sire," he said with a bow. "My ardour carried me away. I beg your majesty to forgive me." "Speak, monsieur, speak without fear. You alone warned us of the disease. Help us to find the cure." "Sire," Villefort said, "the usurper is hated in the south. It appears to me that if he risks his chances there, we can easily rouse Provence and Languedoc against him." "No doubt we can," said the minister, "but he is advancing through Gap and Sisteron." "Advancing? Advancing?" said Louis XVIII. "Is he marching on Paris, then?" The Minister of Police said nothing, but his silence was as eloquent as a confession. "What about the Dauphine?" the king asked Villefort. "Do you think we could raise resistance there as in Provence?" "Sire, I regret to inform your Majesty of an unpalatable truth. Feeling in the Dauphine is not nearly as favourable to us as it is in Provence and Languedoc. The mountain dwellers are Bonapartists, sire." "So his intelligence is good," Louis XVIII muttered. "How many men does he have with him?" "I do not know, sire," said the Minister of Police. "How do you mean you don't know? Did you forget to find out that detail? It is a trivial matter, of course," he added with a disdainful smile. "I was unable to learn it, sire. The dispatch contained only the news of the landing and the route taken by the usurper. And how did you come by this dispatch?" The minister hung his head and blushed brightly. "By the telegraph, sire," he stammered. Louis XVIII stepped forward and crossed his arms, as Napoleon would have done. "You mean," he said, going pale with rage, "that 7 armies overthrew that man? A divine miracle replaced me on the throne of my fathers after 25 years of exile, and during those 25 years I studied, sounded out and analysed the men and the affairs of this country of France that was promised to me, only to attain the object of all my desires, and for a force that I held in the palm of my hand to explode and destroy me." "It is fate, sire," the minister muttered, realising that such a weight, though light in the scales of destiny, was enough to crush a man. "So it is true, what our enemies say about us, nothing learned, nothing forgotten. If I had been betrayed as he was, then that might after all be some consolation, but to be surrounded by people whom I have raised to high office, who should consider my safety more precious than their own, because their interests depend on me, people who were nothing before me and will be nothing after, and to perish miserably through inefficiency and ineptitude. Oh yes, monsieur, you are right indeed. That is fate." The minister was crushed beneath the weight of this terrifying indictment. Monsieur de Blacas wiped a brow damp with sweat, and Villefort smiled to himself because he felt his own importance swelling. "To fall," Louis XVIII continued, having immediately realised the depth of the gulf above which the monarchy was tottering. "To fall, and to learn of one's fall through the telegraph. Oh, I should rather mount the scaffold like my brother Louis XVI than to descend the steps of the Tuileries in this way, driven out by ridicule. Monsieur, you do not know what ridicule means in France, and yet if anyone ought to know—" "Sire," the minister mumbled, "sire, for pity's sake." The king turned to the young man who was standing, motionless, at the back of the room, following the progress of this conversation on which hung the fate of a kingdom. "Come here, Monsieur de Villefort, come, and tell this gentleman that it was possible to have foreknowledge of everything, despite his ignorance of it." "Sire, it was materially impossible to guess at plans which that man had hidden from everybody." "Materially impossible? Those are grand words, monsieur." "Unfortunately, grand words are like grand gentlemen. I have taken the measure of both." "Materially impossible for a minister who has his officials, his offices, his agents, his informers, his spies, and 1,500,000 francs of secret funds to know what is happening 60 leagues off the coast of France. Come, come. Here is this gentleman who had none of these resources at his disposal. This gentleman, a simple magistrate, who knew more than you did with all your police force, and who would have saved my crown if, like you, he had the right to operate the telegraph." The Minister of Police turned with an expression of profound acrimony towards Villefort, who lowered his head with the modesty of triumph. "I am not saying this for you, Blacas," Louis XVIII went on. "Even though you discovered nothing, you did at least have the good sense to persevere in your suspicions. Anyone else might have thought Monsieur de Villefort's revelations insignificant, or else the product of some self-serving ambition." The last was an allusion to what the Minister of Police had said with such confidence an hour earlier. Villefort understood the king's strategy. Another person might have been carried away, intoxicated by this flattery, but he was afraid of making a mortal enemy of the minister, despite knowing that the man was doomed, because even though at the height of his power, the minister had been unable to guess Napoleon's secret, in the final death throes of his fall, he might discover Villefort's. He had only to question Dantes. So Villefort came to the man's aid instead of adding to his misery. "Sire," Villefort said, "the swiftness of the events proves to your majesty that only God, by raising a storm, could have forestalled them. What your majesty attributes to profound perspicacity on my part is purely and simply the outcome of chance. All I have done is to use what chance put in my way as a devoted subject. Do not give me more credit than I deserve, sire, and you will never have to revise your first opinion of me." The Minister of Police thanked the young man with a look, and Villefort knew that his plan had succeeded. Having lost none of the king's gratitude, he had just made a friend on whom he could count, should need be. "Very well," said the king. Then, turning to Monsieur de Blacas and the Minister of Police, "Now, gentlemen, I have no further need of you. You may go. What has to be done from now falls within the province of the Minister of War." "Thankfully, sire, we can count on the army," said Monsieur de Blacas. "Your Majesty knows that every report speaks of its devotion to your Majesty's government." "Don't speak to me of reports, Duke. I know now how much faith I should put in them. But on that subject, Monsieur le Baron, what further news do you have about the matter of the Rue Saint-Jacques?" "The matter of the Rue Saint-Jacques!" Villefort exclaimed, unable to contain himself. Then he stopped short and said, "Forgive me, sire. My devotion to your Majesty continually makes me forget, not the respect that I feel for you, which is too deeply engraved on my heart, but the rules of etiquette." "You may speak out, monsieur," said Louis XVIII. "Today you have earned the right to ask questions." "Sire," the Minister of Police replied, "I was on the point of giving your Majesty the new information that I have gathered about this, when your Majesty's attention was distracted by the terrible disaster on the coast. This information can be of no further interest to His Majesty." "On the contrary, monsieur, this affair seems to me to relate directly to the one uppermost in our minds, and General Quesnel's death may perhaps put us on the trail of an important internal conspiracy." Villefort shuddered at this mention of General Quesnel. "Indeed, sire," the Minister of Police continued, "everything suggests that he was the victim not of suicide as first thought, but of murder. It appears that General Quesnel was coming out of a Bonapartist club when he disappeared. A stranger had visited him the same morning and made an appointment with him in the Rue Saint-Jacques. Unfortunately, the valet, who was doing the general's hair at the time when the stranger was shown into his dressing room, clearly heard him mention the Rue Saint-Jacques, but could not remember the number." While the Minister of Police was giving this information to the king, Villefort, who appeared to hang on his every word, blushed red and then went pale. The king turned to him. "Don't you agree with me, Monsieur de Villefort, that General Quesnel, who might have been thought a supporter of the usurper, but who was in reality entirely loyal to me, was the victim of an ambush by the Bonapartists?" "It seems probable, sire," said Villefort. "Is nothing more known?" "We are tracking down the man who made the appointment with him." Tracking him down?" Villefort repeated. "Yes. The servant gave us a description. He is a man of between 50 and 55 years old, with dark eyes overhung by bushy eyebrows and a moustache." He was dressed in a blue frock coat and wore the rosette of an officer of the Legion of Honour in his buttonhole. A man who precisely answers to this description was followed yesterday, but my agent lost him at the corner of the Rue de la Jussienne and the Rue Coqueron. Villefort had leant against the back of a chair, and while the Minister of Police was speaking, he felt his legs give way beneath him. But when he heard that the stranger had evaded his pursuer, he breathed again. "You must track this man down, monsieur," the king told the Minister of Police. "If, as everything leads me to believe, General Quesnel, who has been so helpful to us at this time, was a victim of murder, whether or not by Bonapartists, I wish his assassins to be cruelly punished." Villefort needed all his self-control to avoid showing the terror he felt on hearing the king's words. "How odd it is," the king continued, with a gesture that expressed his irritation. "The police consider that they have said the last word on the matter when they announce that a murder has been committed, and they have done everything when they add, 'We are tracking down the people responsible.' On this, at least, I hope that your Majesty will have satisfaction." "Very well, we shall see. I shall keep you no longer, Baron. Monsieur de Villefort, you must be tired after your journey. Go and rest. You are doubtless staying with your father." A cloud passed in front of Villefort's eyes. "No, sire, I am staying at the Hôtel de Madrid, in the Rue de Tournon." "You have seen him, I suppose?" "I asked to be taken directly to the Duc de Blacas, sire." "But you will see him, nonetheless?" I think not, sire." "Ah, yes, of course," Louis XVIII said with a smile, indicating that there had been a motive behind this repeated questioning. "I was forgetting the coldness in your relations with Monsieur Notier, and that this is another sacrifice you have made to the royal cause, for which I must compensate you." "Sire, the expression of your Majesty's goodwill is a reward that so far exceeds my ambitions, and I can have nothing further to ask of my king." "No matter, monsieur, have no fear, we shall not forget you. And meanwhile," the king unpinned the cross of the Legion of Honour which he normally wore on his blue coat, next to the cross of Saint Louis, and above the medal of the Order of Notre-Dame du Mont Carmel et de Saint-Lazare, and giving it to Villefort, said, "Meanwhile, take this cross." "But, sire," Villefort said, "your Majesty is mistaken. This is a cross of an officer of the Legion." "So be it, monsieur," said Louis XVIII. "Take it for what it is. I have no time to request another. Blacas, ensure that the certificate is delivered to Monsieur de Villefort." Villefort's eyes moistened with a tear of happiness and pride. He took the cross and kissed it. "And now," he asked, "what orders do I have the honour to receive from your Majesty?" "Take the rest that you need, and consider that, whilst you have no power to serve me in Paris, you can be of the greatest service to me in Marseille." Villefort bowed. "Sire, in an hour I shall have left Paris." "Go then, monsieur, and if I should forget you, for the memory of kings is short, do not hesitate to make yourself known to me. Monsieur le Baron, give the order to fetch the Minister of War. Blacas, stay here." "Monsieur," the Minister of Police said to Villefort as they were leaving the Tuileries, "you have come through the right door. Your fortune is made." "How long will it last?" Villefort murmured, taking leave of the minister, whose career was finished, and looking around for a cab to take him home. One passed along the quay. Villefort waved it down, and the cab drew over. He gave his address to the driver and leapt inside, where he abandoned himself to his ambitious dreams. 10 minutes later he was home. He ordered his horses to be prepared for him to leave in 2 hours, and asked for dinner to be served. He was about to sit down at the table when a firm, clear ring sounded at the door. The valet went to open it, and Villefort heard someone speak his name. "Who can know that I am here so soon?" he wondered. At that moment the valet returned. "What is it?" Villefort answered. "Who was that ringing? Who is asking for me?" A stranger who will not give his name. What anonymous stranger is that? What does he want? He wishes to speak to monsieur. To me? Yes. He asked for me by name? Certainly. And what does this stranger look like? He is a man of around 50, monsieur. Short, tall? About the same size as monsieur. Fair or dark? Dark, very dark, with black hair, black eyes, and black eyebrows. And dressed? Villefort demanded urgently. How is he dressed? In a long blue frock coat, unbuttoned from top to bottom, with the decoration of the Legion of Honour. It is he, Villefort murmured, going pale. By heaven! The person whose description we have twice given appeared on the doorstep. This is a fine way to treat a man. Is it the custom in Marseille for a son to keep his father waiting at the door? Father! Villefort exclaimed. So I was not wrong. I guessed that it must be you. If you guessed as much, the newcomer remarked, putting his cane in a corner and his hat on a chair, then permit me to remark, my dear Gérard, that it is most unfriendly of you to keep me waiting like this. Leave us, Germain, said Villefort. The servant went out, with obvious signs of astonishment. Let's take a sip of tea. Chapter 12. Father and Son. Monsieur Noirtier, for this was the man who had just entered, kept an eye on the servant until the door had closed. Then, doubtless fearing that he might be listening in the antechamber, he went and opened it again behind him. This was no vain precaution, and the speed of Germain's retreat proved that he was no stranger to the sin that caused the downfall of our first parents. Monsieur Noirtier then took the trouble to go himself and shut the door of the antechamber, returned and shut that of the bedroom, slid the bolts, and went over to take Villefort's hand. The young man, meanwhile, had been following these manoeuvres with a surprise from which he had not yet recovered. "How now? Do you know, dear Gérard," Noirtier said, looking at his son with an ambiguous smile, "that you do not appear altogether overjoyed at seeing me?" "On the contrary, father," said Villefort, "I am delighted, but your visit is so unexpected that I am somewhat dazed by it." "My dear friend," Noirtier continued, taking a seat, "I might say the same myself. How is this? You tell me that you are getting engaged in Marseille on the 28th of February, and on March the 3rd you are in Paris?" "If I am here, father," said Gérard, going across to Monsieur Noirtier, "do not complain about it. I came for your sake, and this journey may perhaps save your life." "Indeed?" said Monsieur Noirtier, casually leaning back in the chair where he was sitting. "Indeed? Tell me about it, Monsieur le Magistrat. I am most curious." "Have you heard about a certain Bonapartist club that meets in the Rue Saint-Jacques?" "At number 53? Yes, I am its vice-president." "Father! I am amazed by your composure. What do you expect, dear boy? When one has been proscribed by the Montagnards, left Paris in a hay cart, and been hunted across the moorlands of Bordeaux by Robespierre's bloodhounds, one is inured to most things. So continue. What has happened in this club in the Rue Saint-Jacques?" "What has happened is that General Quesnel was called to it, and that General Quesnel, having left home at 9 in the evening, was pulled out of the Seine 2 days later." "And who told you this fine story?" "The king himself." "Well, now in exchange for your story, I have some news to tell you." "Father, I think I already know what you are about to say." "Ah, so you already know about the landing of His Majesty the Emperor?" "I beg you not to say such things, father. Firstly for your own sake, and then for mine. I did know this piece of news. I knew it even before you did, because over the past 3 days I have been pounding the road between Marseille and Paris, raging at my inability to project the thought that was burning through my skull and send it 200 leagues ahead of me." 3 days ago? Were you mad? The Emperor had not landed 3 days ago. "No matter. I knew of his plans. How did you know? From a letter addressed to you from the island of Elba. To me? To you. I intercepted it in the messenger's wallet. If that letter had fallen into another's hands, father, you might have already been shot. Villefort's father burst out laughing. Come, it seems that the Restoration has taken lessons from the Empire in how to expedite matters. Shot, my dear boy, you are being carried away. So where is this letter? I know you better than to imagine you would leave it lying around. I burned it, to make sure that not a scrap remained. That letter was your death warrant. And death knell to your future career, Noirtier replied coldly. Yes, I understand that, but I have nothing to fear, since you are protecting me. I have done better still, monsieur. I have saved you. The devil you have! This is becoming more dramatic still. Explain what you mean. I am again referring to the club in the Rue Saint-Jacques. The gentlemen of police seem most attached to this club. Why did they not look more carefully? They would have found it. They have not yet found it, but they are on the trail. That's the usual phrase, I know. When the police are at a loss, they say they are on the trail, and the government waits patiently until they come and whisper that the trail has gone cold. Yes, but they have found a body. General Quesnel was killed, and in every country in the world that is called murder. Murder, you say? But there is nothing to prove that the general was murdered. People are found every day in the Seine when they threw themselves in despair or drowned because they could not swim. Father, you know very well that the general did not drown himself in despair, and that no one bathes in the Seine in January. No, make no mistake. His death has indeed been attributed to murder. Who made the attribution? The king himself. The king? I thought him enough of a philosopher to realise that there is no such thing as murder in politics. You know as well as I do, my dear boy, that in politics there are no people, only ideas, no feelings, only interests. In politics, you don't kill a man, you remove an obstacle, that's all. Do you want to know what happened? I'll tell you. We thought we could count on General Quesnel. He had been recommended to us from the island of Elba. One of us went round to his house and invited him to attend a meeting in the Rue Saint-Jacques, where he would be among friends. He came and was told the whole plan. Departure from the island of Elba, the intended landing place. Then, when he had listened to everything and heard everything, and there was no more for him to learn, he announced that he was a royalist. At this we all looked at one another. We obliged him to take an oath, and he did so, but truly with such little good grace that it was tempting God to swear in that way. In spite of all, however, we let him go freely, quite freely. He did not return home. What do you expect, my dear? He left us and must have taken the wrong road, that's all. A murder! Really, Villefort, you surprise me. You, a deputy crown prosecutor, making an accusation founded on such poor evidence. Have I ever told you, when you have done your job as a royalist and had the head cut off one of our people, my son, you have committed murder? No, I have said, very well, monsieur, you have fought and won, but tomorrow we shall have our revenge. Father, beware. Our revenge will be terrible when we take it. I don't understand. Are you counting on the usurper's return? I confess I am. You are wrong, father. He will no sooner have got 10 leagues into France than he will be pursued, hunted down and captured like a wild animal. My good friend, the Emperor is at this moment on the road for Grenoble. On the 10th or 12th he will be in Lyons, and on the 20th or the 25th in Paris. The people will rise up to march before him. He has only a handful of men with him, and they will send armies against him, which will provide an escort for him to return to the capital. The truth, my dear Gérard, is that you are only still a child. You think you are well informed because the telegraph told you. 3 days after the landing, the usurper has landed at Cannes with a few men. He is being pursued. But where is he? What is he doing? You have no idea. He is being pursued. That's all you know. Well, they will pursue him as far as Paris without firing a shot. Grenoble and Lyon are loyal cities which will offer an invincible barricade against him. Grenoble will open its doors and acclaim him. The whole of Lyon will march in his van. Believe me, we are as well informed as you are, and our police are at least the equal of yours. Do you want proof? Here it is. You tried to hide your journey from me, yet I knew about your arrival half an hour after you had entered Paris. You gave your address to no one except your postilion, yet I know your address. And to prove it, I arrived here at the very moment when you were sitting down to eat. So ring for your servant to set another place, and we shall dine together. I have to admit, replied Villefort, looking at his father with astonishment, you seem very well informed. Heavens, it's simple enough. You people who hold power have only what can be bought for money. We, who are waiting to gain power, have what is given out of devotion. Devotion? Villefort laughed. Yes, devotion. That is the honest way to describe ambition when it has expectations. Villefort's father stretched out his own hand towards the bell-pull to call for the servant, since his son would not do it. Villefort restrained him. What, father, wait. Another word. Say it. However incompetent the royalist police may be, they do know one dreadful thing. Which is the description of the man who visited General Quesnel on the day of his disappearance. Ah, the fine police know that, do they? And what is the description? Dark in colouring, black hair, side whiskers and eyes, a blue frock coat buttoned up to the chin, the rosette of an officer of the Legion of Honour in his buttonhole, a broad-brimmed hat and a rattan cane. Ha! Ha! So they know that, said Noirtier. In that case, why do they not have their hands on this man? Because they lost him, yesterday or the day before, on the corner of the Rue Coqueron. Didn't I tell you your police were idiots? Yes, but at any moment they may find him. Yes, Noirtier said, looking casually around him. Yes, if the man is not warned. But, he added, smiling, he has been warned, and he will change his appearance and his clothing. At these words, he got up, took off his coat and cravat, went over to a table on which everything was lying ready for his son's toilet, took a razor, lathered his face, and, with a perfectly steady hand, shaved off the compromising side whiskers which had provided such a precious clue for the police. Villefort watched him with terror, not unmixed with admiration. Once he had finished shaving, Noirtier rearranged his hair. Instead of his black cravat, he took one of a different colour, which was lying on top of an open trunk. Instead of his blue-buttoned coat, he slipped on one of Villefort's, which was brown and flared. In front of the mirror, he tried on the young man's hat, with its turned-up brim, seemed to find that it suited him, and, leaving his rattan cane where he had rested it against the fireplace, he took a little bamboo switch that the dandyish deputy prosecutor would use to give himself that off-hand manner which was one of his main attributes, and twirled it in his wiry hand. "How's that?" he said, turning back to his astonished son after completing this sort of conjuring trick. "Do you think that your police will recognise me now?" No, father," stammered Villefort. "I hope not, at least." "My dear Gérard, I rely on your prudence to dispose of all these objects that I am leaving in your care." "Oh, father, have no fear," said Villefort. "Indeed, I shall not. And now I believe you are right, and that you may indeed have saved my life. But rest assured, I shall shortly repay the service." Villefort shook his head. "Don't you believe me?" "I hope at least that you are mistaken. Will you see the king again?" "I may." "Do you wish him to think you have the power of prophecy?" "Those who prophesy misfortune are unwelcome in court, father." "Yes, but they are more justly treated in the long run. Suppose there is a second restoration, then you will be considered a great man." "So what must I tell the king?" "Tell him this. Sire, you have been deceived. about the mood of the country, opinions in the towns, and the spirits of the army. The man whom you in Paris call the Corsican ogre, and who is still called the usurper in Nevers, is already hailed as Bonaparte in Lyons and as emperor in Grenoble. You think he is being hunted down, hounded and fleeing, but he is marching as swiftly as the eagle which he brings back with him. His soldiers, whom you've believed to be dying of starvation, exhausted and ready to desert, are increasing in numbers like snowflakes around a snowball as it plunges down a hill. Sire, leave France to her true master, who acquired her not for gold, but by conquest. Leave, sire, not because you are in any danger, your adversary is strong enough to spare you, but because it would be humiliating for a grandson of Saint Louis to owe his life to the man of Arcole, Marengo, and Austerlitz. Tell him that, Gérard. Or rather, no, tell him nothing. Conceal your journey. Don't boast of anything that you intended to do or have done in Paris. Take the coach, and if you pounded the road in coming, fly like a bird as you return. Go back to Marseille at night, enter your house by the back door, and stay there quietly, humbly, secretly, and above all, harmlessly. Because this time, I promise you, we shall act as determined men who know their enemies. Go, my son. Go, my dear Gérard, and provided you are obedient to your father's orders, or, if you prefer, respectful of the wishes of a friend, we shall allow you to keep your office. Noirtier smiled. This will give you an opportunity to save me for the second time, should the political seesaw one day raise you up again and put me down. Farewell, my dear Gérard. On your next visit, stay with me. At this, Noirtier left, as calm as he had been throughout the length of this difficult interview. Villefort, pale and troubled, ran to the window, parted the curtains, and saw him go by, tranquil and unmoved, between 2 or 3 sinister-looking men who were stationed by the boundary posts or at the corner of the street, and who may well have been there to arrest a man with black whiskers, wearing a blue coat and a broad-brimmed hat. He remained standing where he was, holding his breath, until his father had vanished beyond the Carrefour Bussy. Then he rushed to the things that Noirtier had left behind, thrust the black cravat and blue frock coat into the bottom of his trunk, twisted the hat and concealed it in the bottom of a cupboard, and broke the rattan cane into 3 pieces, which he threw on the fire. Then he put on a travelling cap, called his valet, giving him a look that forbade him to ask any of the 1,000 questions that were on his lips, settled his account with the hotel, leapt into the carriage which was waiting for him with the horses already harnessed, learnt in Lyons that Bonaparte had just entered Grenoble, and, in the midst of the turmoil that he found throughout the whole length of the road, arrived in Marseille, a prey to all the agonized feelings that enter a man's heart when he has ambition and has been honoured for the first time. Just going to down my tea before it gets too cold. Chapter 13. The 100 Days. Monsieur Noirtier was a good prophet, and events moved quickly, as he had said. Everyone knows about the return from Elba, that strange and miraculous return, with no earlier precedent and probably destined to remain unique for all time. Louis XVIII made only feeble efforts to ward off this terrible blow. His lack of confidence in men deprived him of any confidence in events. Kingship, or rather the monarchy which he had barely rebuilt, was already trembling on its uncertain foundations, and a single gesture from the emperor brought the entire edifice crashing down, a shapeless compound of old prejudices and new ideas. So Villefort received nothing from his king except gratitude, and that was not only useless for the time being, but actually dangerous, and the cross of the Legion of Honour which he was wise enough not to display, even though Monsieur de Blacas had done as the king required and duly sent him the certificate. Villefort would surely have been dismissed by Napoleon had it not been for the protection of Noailles, who had become all-powerful at court under the 100 Days, both for the danger that he had run and for the services he had rendered. So, as promised, the Girondin of '93 and the Senator of 1806 protected the man who had earlier protected him. Consequently, all Villefort's efforts during this reincarnation of the Empire, which it was not difficult to predict would fall again, consisted in suppressing the secret which Dantes had been on the point of divulging. The Crown Prosecutor alone was dismissed, suspected of lack of enthusiasm for Bonapartism. The imperial regime was re-established, which meant that the Emperor moved into the Tuileries that Louis XVIII had just left, and began to issue a host of different orders from the little study into which, hard on the heels of Villefort, we recently introduced our readers, and from the walnut table on which he found Louis XVIII's snuff-box, wide open and still half full. And no sooner had this happened than Marseille, despite the attitude of its judiciary, began to feel the warmth of those smouldering fires of civil war that are never entirely extinguished in the south. The reprisals threatened to exceed the occasional rowdy outburst against the houses of royalists who decided to stay indoors, or public insults hurled at those who ventured outside. Naturally, the turn of events meant that the worthy shipowner, whom we have already described as a supporter of the People's Party, found himself in these circumstances, if not exactly all-powerful, since Monsieur Morel was a cautious and slightly timid man, like all those who have made their fortunes in trade by their own laborious efforts, at least able to stand up and lodge a complaint, even though he was dismissed as a moderate by Bonapartist fanatics. And his complaint, as one may easily imagine, concerned Dantes. Villefort had remained on his feet, despite his superior's dismissal, but his wedding, although still agreed in principle, had been postponed until more propitious times. If the Emperor should keep his throne, then Gérard would need to marry into another family, and his father would find a suitable match for him. If Louis XVIII returned to France under a second restoration, Monsieur de Saint-Marin's influence and his own would be greatly increased, and the union become more favourable to him than ever. So, for the time being, the deputy crown prosecutor was the principal magistrate in Marseille, and one day his door opened, and Monsieur Morel was announced. Anyone else would have hastened to greet the shipowner, betraying his own weakness in his haste. But Villefort was a man of superior intelligence, who, though he had little experience of the world, had an instinct for it. He kept Monsieur Morel waiting, as he would have done under the Restoration, not because he had anyone with him, but simply because it is normal for a crown prosecutor to keep people waiting. Then, after a quarter of an hour, which he spent reading 2 or 3 newspapers of various persuasions, he gave the order for the shipowner to be shown in. Monsieur Morel expected to find Villefort dejected, but he found him as he had seen him 6 weeks earlier. That is to say, calm, firm, and full of the distant good manners that make up the most impenetrable of barriers separating a well-bred man from one of the people. He had entered Villefort's chambers convinced that the magistrate would tremble at the sight of him, only to discover that, on the contrary, he was himself overcome with nervousness and anxiety when confronted with this man who was waiting for him with an inquiring look and his elbows resting on his desk. He paused at the door. Villefort examined him, as though he could not quite remember who he was. At last, after studying him in silence for some seconds, during which the good shipowner twisted and untwisted his hat in his hands, Villefort said, "Monsieur Morel, I believe." "Yes, monsieur, I am he," the shipowner replied. The magistrate gestured protectively with his hand. "Come over here and tell me to what I owe the honour of this visit." "Have you no idea, monsieur?" Monsieur Morel asked. "Not in the slightest. but that does not in any way prevent me from wishing to serve you, if it is in my power to do so." "It depends entirely on you, monsieur," said Morel. "So please explain." "Monsieur," continued the ship-owner, gaining in confidence as he spoke, and further strengthened by the justice of his case and the clarity of his position, "you remember that, a few days before the news of His Majesty the Emperor's landing, I came to beg your indulgence for an unfortunate young man, a sailor who was second mate on board my brig. You will recall that he was accused of being in contact with the island of Elba. This connection, though a crime in those days, is now a recommendation. At that time you served Louis XVIII, and you did so unreservedly, monsieur. That was your duty. Today you are serving Napoleon, and you should protect him. That, too, is your duty. So I have come to ask you what became of him." Villefort struggled to contain his feelings. "What is the man's name?" he asked. "Please be so good as to tell me his name." "Edmond Dantès." Of course, Villefort would have been as happy to confront an armed adversary in a duel at 25 paces as to have this name fired at him point blank. Yet he did not raise an eyebrow. In this way, he thought, no one can accuse me of having any purely personal interest in the arrest of this young man. "Dantès?" he asked aloud. "Edmond Dantès, you say?" "Yes, monsieur." Villefort opened a large register housed in a pigeonhole near his desk, then crossed to a table, and from the table went over to some files before turning back to the ship-owner. "Are you sure that you are not mistaken, monsieur?" he asked, in the most natural tone of voice. If Morel had been more sharp-witted or better informed about the matter, he would have found it odd that the deputy crown prosecutor even deigned to answer him on a subject which was entirely outside his competence. And he might have wondered why Villefort did not send him to consult the prison registers, prison governors, or the prefect of the department. But Morel, who had looked in vain for any sign of fear in Villefort, as soon as the man appeared to have none, perceived only a desire to oblige. He was no match for Villefort. "No, monsieur," Morel said, "I am not mistaken. In any case, I have known the poor lad for 10 years, and he has served under me for 4. Don't you remember? I came to see you 6 weeks ago to ask for clemency on behalf of this unfortunate young man, just as today I am asking for justice. In fact, your manner was quite off-hand, and you spoke to me as though displeased by my inquiry. Oh, Bonapartists could expect harsh treatment from royalists in those days." Villefort parried this thrust with his usual agility and cool-headedness. "Monsieur, I was a royalist as long as I considered the Bourbons not only the rightful heirs to the throne, but also the choice of the nation. However, the miraculous turn of events that we have just witnessed proved to me that I was wrong. Napoleon's genius has triumphed. The legitimate monarch is the one who has the love of the people." "Pleased to hear it at last," Morel exclaimed, with bluff sincerity. "When you speak in that way, it augurs well for Edmond." "Wait," Villefort continued, leafing through another register. "He was a sailor, isn't that right, who was marrying a Catalan girl?" Yes, I remember now. It was a very serious matter." "How serious?" "You know that when he left here he was taken to the prison at the Palais de Justice." "So?" "Well, I made my report to Paris and sent the papers that were found on him. That was my duty. What else could I do? A week after his arrest, the prisoner was transferred." "Transferred?" Monsieur Morel exclaimed. "What can have been done with the poor boy?" "Don't worry. He would have been taken to Fenestrelle in Pinarol on the Ile Sainte-Marguerite, which is officially described as transportation. One fine day you will see him return to take command of his ship." "He can come back whenever he likes. The post will be kept for him. But why is he not back already? I should have thought that the first priority of Bonapartist justice would have been to release those who were imprisoned under the royalist regime." "Don't be too eager to make accusations, my dear Monsieur Morel," Villefort replied. "Due process of law must be observed in everything." The order for his incarceration came from the highest authority, and the order for his release must do likewise. Napoleon has only been back a fortnight, so the annulments can only just have been sent out. But is there no way of expediting the formalities now that we are back in power? I have some friends and some influence. I could have the judgment reversed. There was no judgment in this case. The detention order, then? In political cases there is no register of detainees. It is sometimes in the interest of governments to make a person disappear without trace. Detention orders would help to find him. Perhaps that's how things were under the Bourbons, but now, that's how things are at all times, my dear Monsieur Morel. One regime follows another and resembles its predecessor. The Penitentiary System established under Louis XIV still applies, apart from the Bastille. The Emperor was always stricter than even the Sun King himself when it came to the management of his prisons. The number of prisons whose names do not figure on any register is incalculable. Even certainty would have been misled by such benevolent concern, and Monsieur Morel did not even feel suspicion. "So, finally, Monsieur de Villefort," he said, "what advice would you give me to hasten poor Dantès' return?" "Just this, monsieur. Make a petition to the Minister of Justice." "Yes, but we know what happens to petitions. The minister gets 200 a day and doesn't read 4 of them." "Certainly," Villefort agreed, "but he will read a petition that is sent by me, certified by me, and personally addressed by me." "Would you undertake to send such a petition?" "With the greatest pleasure. Dantès might have been guilty then, but he is innocent now, and it is my duty to have him released, just as it was once my duty to have him imprisoned." In this way, Villefort could avoid running the risk, small though it might be, of an inquiry that would certainly prove his undoing. "How does one go about writing to the minister?" "Sit here, Monsieur Morel," Villefort said, giving the ship-owner his chair. "I shall dictate the letter." "Would you really be so kind?" "Of course. Let's lose no more time. We have wasted enough already." "Yes, monsieur. Consider how the poor lad must be waiting, suffering, and perhaps giving way to despair." Villefort shuddered at the idea of the prisoner cursing him in the darkness and silence, but he had gone too far to retreat. Dantès would have to be broken between the cogs of his ambition. "I'm ready," the ship-owner said, sitting in Villefort's chair and taking up a pen. So Villefort dictated a request, in which, undoubtedly with the best of intentions, he exaggerated Dantès' patriotism and the service he had rendered to the Bonapartist cause. In it, Dantès became one of the most significant figures in ensuring Napoleon's return. Clearly, when he saw the document, the minister must immediately see that justice was done, if it had not been done already. When they had completed the petition, Villefort read it out. "That's it," he said. "Now count on me." "Will the petition be sent soon, monsieur?" "This very day." "Certified by you?" "The finest apostille I can put on it is to certify that all you have said in this request is true." Villefort resumed his place and stamped his certification on a corner of the petition. "So what do we have to do now?" asked Morel. "Wait," Villefort replied. "I shall look after everything." Morel's hopes were raised by this assurance. He left the deputy prosecutor's office delighted with himself, and went to tell Dantès' father that he would be seeing his son before long. As for Villefort, instead of sending the request to Paris, he put it carefully aside for safekeeping, knowing that what might save Dantès in the present would become a disastrously compromising document in the future, in the event, which the situation in Europe and course of affairs already allowed him to predict, of a second restoration. so Dantes remained a prisoner. In the depths of the dungeon where he was buried, no sound reached him of the resounding crash of Louis XVIII's throne, or of the still more dreadful collapse of the empire. Villefort, however, had watched all this closely and listened to it attentively. On 2 occasions during the brief reappearance of the emperor known as the 100 Days, Monsieur Morel had renewed his efforts, always demanding that Dantes be released, and each time Villefort had reassured him with promises and expectations. Finally, Waterloo. Morel was not again seen at Villefort's. The shipowner had done everything humanly possible for his young friend, and if he were to make any further attempt under this second restoration, he would compromise himself to no useful end. Louis XVIII returned to the throne. For Villefort, Marseille was full of memories that were soured with remorse, so he requested and obtained the vacant post of Crown Prosecutor in Toulouse. A fortnight after moving into his new home, he married Mademoiselle Renée de Saint-Marin, whose father was more in favour at court than ever. So it was that Dantes, during the 100 Days and after Waterloo, remained under lock and key, forgotten, if not by men, at least by God. When Danglars witnessed Napoleon's return to France, he realized the full effect of the blow he had directed against Dantes. His denunciation had been accurate, and, like all men with a certain natural aptitude for crime and only average understanding of ordinary life, he described this strange coincidence as a decree of Providence. But when Napoleon had returned to Paris, and his voice, imperious and powerful, was heard once more in the land, Danglars knew fear. At every moment he expected Dantes to reappear, a Dantes who knew everything, a Dantes who was strong and who threatened every kind of vengeance. So he gave Monsieur Morel notice of his desire to renounce seafaring, and obtained a reference from him to a Spanish trader, whose service he entered as accounts clerk towards the end of March, that is to say 10 or 12 days after Napoleon's return to the Tuileries. He left for Madrid, and nothing more was heard of him. As for Fernand, he understood nothing. Dantes had gone away, that was enough. What had happened to him? Fernand did not try to find out. Throughout the reprieve that this absence gave him, he strove, partly to mislead Mercedes about the reasons for it, and partly to devise plans for emigration and abduction. From time to time, these were the dark moments in his life, he also sat at the extremity of the Cap Pharo, at the point from which you can see both Marseille and the Catalan village, sad, motionless as a bird of prey, watching in case he might see, by returning by one or other of these routes, the handsome young man who walked freely, with his head held high, and who, for Fernand also, had become the messenger of a cruel revenge. In that event, Fernand was decided. He would break Dantes's skull with his gun, and then, he thought, afterwards kill himself to disguise the murder. But Fernand was mistaken. He would never kill himself, because he lived in hope. While this was happening, among all these painful changes, the Empire called for a final muster of soldiers, and every man who was capable of bearing arms marched across the frontier of France in obedience to the Emperor's resounding call. Fernand set off with the rest, leaving his hut, leaving Mercedes, devoured by the dark and dreadful thought that, when he had gone, his rival might return and marry the woman he loved. If ever Fernand meant to kill himself, he would have done so on leaving Mercedes. His attentions to the young woman, the pity which he appeared to feel for her in her misfortune, and the care that he took to anticipate the least of her wishes, had produced the effect that an appearance of devotion inevitably produces on a generous heart. Mercedes had always loved Fernand as a friend, and now her friendship towards him was increased by a new feeling, gratitude. "My brother," she said, fastening his conscript's bag across the Catalan's shoulders, my only friend, do not let yourself be killed. Do not leave me alone in the world where I weep and where I shall be entirely alone if you leave it." These words, spoken on his departure, gave Fernand new hope. If Dantes did not return, then Mercedes might be his. Mercedes remained alone in that bare landscape, which had never appeared to her more arid, bounded by the vastness of the sea. Bathed in tears, like the mad woman whose painful story we have heard, she could be seen wandering continually around the little Catalan village, now pausing beneath the burning southern sun, standing motionless and silent as a statue, looking towards Marseille, now seated on the shore, listening to the moaning of the sea, as endless as her sorrow, and ceaselessly wondering if it would not be better to lean forward, sink beneath her own weight into the abyss, and let herself be swallowed up, rather than to suffer all the cruel uncertainties of hopeless expectation. It was not the fact that Mercedes lacked the courage to carry out this intention, but the succour of religion that saved her from suicide. Caderousse was called up as Fernand had been, but being 8 years older than the Catalan and married, he was not recruited until the third wave of conscription and sent to guard the coast. Old Dantes, who had been sustained only by hope, lost hope when the emperor fell. 5 months to the day after being separated from his son, and almost at the very hour when Dantes was arrested, he breathed his last in Mercedes's arms. Monsieur Morel undertook to pay all the expenses of the funeral and settled the trifling debts that the old man had run up during his last illness. It took more than benevolence to do this. It took courage. The South was ablaze, and to assist the father of a Bonapartist as dangerous as Dantes, even on his deathbed, was a crime.